Good morning and welcome to today's briefing at the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Dekel-Fleissig, Director of JPC. The war erupted nearly 8 months ago when Israel was facing deep political and social divisions surrounding the government's legal reform plan. An emergency unity government had since formed, though its stability is in question, with Benny Gantz issuing an ultimatum to the Prime Minister last month, and a subsequent bill to dissolve the Knesset submitted, as well as threats from Benjamin Netanyahu's own coalition partners against promoting a ceasefire deal and steps towards Haredi enlistment. Meanwhile, polls show that much of the Israeli public wants early elections. Our guest today is Professor Gayil Talshir, a political science researcher and senior lecturer in the political science department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she specializes in the study of political ideologies and the crisis of democracy. Her most recent research deals with the ideology of the Israeli government during the Netanyahu era, a long one. Professor Talshir, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I think what I'll start with is just a reminder of the setting, okay? This government got into office by December 22, and officially, at least, it has until 2026 to run its full course. But we're gathering today in a very dramatic week or weeks in which we may see the dissolvement of this government. I just want to remind you that right at the outset, on January 4, the Minister of Justice, Levin, and Netanyahu have actually declared what we call a constitutional coup d'etat. And for the last year and a half, Israel was in one of the most severe cleavages and riots, civic riots that Israel has ever known, fighting for its own survival as a liberal democracy. So this is the context in which we have to see what happened after October 7 and the way that we got into the war in Gaza and possibly other fronts too. But the kind of cleavage, or maybe even the polarized society with which Israel got into the situation, is something that we have to have in mind, because the kind of talking about unity beyond all is actually just a plaster on very, very severe cleavages that we may see erupting politically over the next few weeks. So why is it such a dramatic week today? Because I think the three major fronts that we're dealing with are about to erupt. The first is, of course, the deal around the hostages that Biden actually put forward in the name of the Israeli government. And as we know, the war cabinet has went around the table, and one after another, all the members of the war cabinet actually confirmed this deal. This was not what Netanyahu said to his own ministers in his government. So the kind of tensions around this deal already exposed the kind of tensions between the war cabinet and Netanyahu's government. And as we know, on Saturday, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot supposed to leave the government and go back to the opposition. So the first junction that we need to think about is whether really Gantz and Eisenkot are going to leave this government, and what it means in terms of the unity of the government. And from the streets and the media, it sounds as if Gantz's being part of the government was the main issue. Just when he is going to leave the government, we are actually going to see this government going for early elections, but this is not really the case. In Israel, it is never the case that coalitions crumble because the opposition tables a vote of no confidence. So the reality of Gantz's proposal being tabled, of actually maturing into an early election, is close to zero. The only way that, or the major way that coalitions terminate their term early in Israel is when the coalition crumbles into itself. So when the coalition itself or the prime minister decide to dismiss the Knesset and go for early elections. And this is the junction that we're standing in right this week. Why is it so crucial? Because the Supreme Court is going to give its ruling, maybe even tonight, on the issue of the draft of the Ultra-Orthodox. For the first time, the court is going to say very loud and clearly that given that there is no other law that actually exempts the Ultra-Orthodox from being drafted to the IDF, the current legal situation is that the IDF and the government have to actually draft the Ultra-Orthodox, which means that we're going to immediately go into a political crisis. Now, this crisis is going to get into the Knesset on Monday, because on Monday, they're going to vote on a law that's supposed to bypass some of the difficulties that Netanyahu has in passing the law of the draft as he wanted to. So 2 minutes about this issue, because it may be the case that next week or the week after, we are going to see the government actually breaking around this law. And if it's not going to be next week, it may be until July. So what is happening actually there? What is happening is that the Ultra-Orthodox and the Minister of Defense and Gantz's people were sitting inside one room trying to get some sort of compromise. And 1 month ago, this compromise fell into pieces. The Ultra-Orthodox said there is no way to bridge the gap between what we want. What they basically want is that no one who is registered as an Ultra-Orthodox will actually be drafted. I'm stressing not somebody who is actually studying Torah, but somebody who is just registered as someone who is studying Torah instead of going to the IDF. And of course, Gantz and Gallant, given the war situation, want the draft to be much more significant than it was until now, coming from the Ultra-Orthodox. So the conversations actually crumbled. And then Deri and Gafni went to Netanyahu and said, if you're not going to pass the law, we are going to leave the government. And this is where they found a different track and a different kind of law, which they wanted to get the vote for. But already for this alternative law, they saw that they will not have the vote. So Deri came up with what is going to happen on Monday. And this is the following trick, the political trick of Deri. They say, you know what, we're going to go to a previous law that was already confirmed in a Lapid and Bennett's government of 2 years ago, just to bypass the need to actually vote for the law in the Knesset. And then it's going to go into the committees and it's going to be redrafted. So why is it a trick? Because the whole idea was to get the government in one piece until the end of July, which is when the government actually goes for the summer vacation, which means that the government will survive until the autumn, which means that the elections would not be before January. Why is it what Netanyahu wants? Because Netanyahu wants his government to hold until Trump, in his vision, is getting back into power. Okay, so the question whether the government is going to crumble over the next 2 weeks or it's going to crumble in a month and a half in July is crucial to the question when would early election take place should the Knesset dismiss itself. So how are we standing with the vote on Monday? The vote on Monday is supposed to be a procedural vote. So Netanyahu was making many conversations over the last 2 weeks with his backbenchers, saying to them, you know, even if you resist the actual draft law, draft law, just vote yes for the procedural vote on Monday. Because the ultra-Orthodox are going to do something which they have never done before. They're going to positively vote for a law which they think that is utterly a contrast to the halacha. So they want to make sure that if they vote for this law, all the coalition partners are going to vote with them to make sure that this law actually passes. The chances are not very good for the coalition to be able to pass this vote. Why? Because the ultra-Orthodox themselves have many reservations about their act of positively endorsing something that they don't believe in. And second, there are about 11 or 12 people from within the coalition, from the Likud and from religious Zionism, that already said that they object to the kind of law that Netanyahu and Deri and Gafni are going to table. So even if it's going to pass the law, the vote on Monday, it is most likely not going to be an option to actually vote positively for this law in July. So this is the one moment in which the ultra-Orthodox may leave the government, or that 5 of the coalition people will not vote with the coalition, which means that there will be no option to actually pass a law, which means that the ultra-Orthodox may indeed leave the government. So this is on this front. The other front, which is crucial, is of course what's happening with the hostages deal and the Saudi deal. What we already know is that Netanyahu said no to Sullivan, meaning that Israel is not going to be part of the Saudi American deal for the time being. Israel has an exit, can always enter later in the game. But we also know that Netanyahu did confirm the hostages deal, which is on the table now, and Hamas through Saudi just said this morning that because there is no actual and cease of the fire, a permanent one, that they rejected. So this front may also end up being very explosive in terms of the Israeli government, because should the negotiation mature into the deal, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will find it very hard to actually remain in the government. So just to sum up, there are 3 big alternatives to how this government is going to dismiss itself. One is on the draft issue. The second is on the hostages issue. And the third is what is going to happen in civil society. Because as I started my talk, I already told you that the reason why a 64 majority and a very clear strong-willed government was unable to pass the constitutional coup d'etat was because of the hundreds of thousands of Israelis that came into the streets and said, we will not give our hand or our consent to changing the rules of the democratic game in Israel. And these people are already gathering again in the streets with an extra rage on what is happening in the north and in the in the south with the hostages and with the internal dealing of the war and of the economy. So it may be the case that the pressure from the outside would actually force Netanyahu to take a decision. What kind of decision Netanyahu can take? Netanyahu can take the initiative himself and say, I will declare the Knesset dismissed and early elections, because that way his coalition didn't crumble. It was his initiative to go for an early election. The one condition he will have, first of all, is to have it after the elections in the US, because he wants to wait for Trump. And second, the kind of who is going to remain in this government in transition, which is something which Netanyahu cares about. The last sentence I'll say before opening for questions is that there is another option, and that is what we call a vote of no confidence, in which in Israel you have to have an alternative government which you positively vote for if you want to replace this government without going through elections. And this may be also on the cards, something which Netanyahu actually really fears, that he is going to have a kind of riot within his own ranks, and that people from his own party are going to go with the opposition and just replace Netanyahu as a prime minister while remaining in a new broad national unity government. This is also something which plays into Netanyahu's fears, which may actually cause him to call an early elections himself.
Okay, thank you very much for that for the opening remarks. A few questions have come up. You've studied Netanyahu quite a bit over the years. In your opinion, do you think that he will continue to be able to stave off pressure from the Biden administration to complete the ceasefire deal, given that, of course, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have threatened to leave the coalition, and what this actually means at the end of the day for him and for his government, and for maybe their ability to implement such a deal in the first place?
If you look at Netanyahu's legacy, on the positive side, it's the Abraham Accord, but on the negative side, Netanyahu, for all the last 15 years, his great mission was to crush the Palestinian Authority as a viable partner or as an entity in itself. And since you cannot have a Saudi, American, Israeli deal without the Palestinians on board, which makes sense because what you want to do, and this is Netanyahu's legacy for many, many years, that he wants to have an alliance of those more moderate states in the Middle East that oppose Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, etc. You cannot do it without the Palestinians, because you have to take the Palestinians away from the jihadistic axis to the more moderate axis, and therefore Netanyahu actually rejected the Saudi deal. He thinks that once Trump comes into office, he could have the deal without the Palestinians. Okay, so in terms of his own legacy, he wants to postpone the actual decision until after Trump is on board. But the Biden administration is putting a lot of pressure, because the Biden administration is in close contact with all the people in the war cabinet, Derry and Gallant and Gantz and Eisenkot and even Dremer, which means that Netanyahu understands that he is going to remain isolated. Also, I think the personal cost for Netanyahu in The Hague is something which may change Netanyahu's way of looking at the international arena. And I think this is why he showed positive signs in terms of the hostages deal. Realistically, the Hamas is on the other side, and Hamas already said no even to this deal. So I think Netanyahu's government would not crumble on this front, but on the other internal front of the Ultra-Orthodox and the draft.
And how do the events on our northern border impact the political situation right now? We're seeing things getting worse from day to day, even with the explosions over the Druze village of Holfish yesterday. Things are not looking better on that front. And how is this impacting the situation politically?
if we look at what happens, the Hezbollah kind of line was, as long as there is an active war with Hamas in Gaza, we're going to remain in a war situation against Israel, but we do not want an all-out war. Now, what you see coming from the Israeli government and from those ministers that usually do not say anything about the military front is more and more pressure to actually get into a more substantive military war against Lebanon and Hezbollah. The only way to stop that is to have a quick ending of the Gaza front. And it may be the case since the kind of acceleration of what we see over the last days, that it would not hold, that Israel would have to get into a second front in the north before the Gaza war is over. It's clear that Israel cannot just leave the north front as it is, because Israel evacuated 60,000, about, it depends who counts, but around 100,000 people. So that means that the real plan is to finish the Gaza war and then see how you can get into either diplomatic or a quick military operation in the north to end to change the balance in the north. As you say, it may erupt not according to plan. So the plan is finish the Gaza war, and then the North Front would actually get quieter, but it may be too late for that.
Okay, moving back to a few of the things you had touched on before, one journalist is asking whether any party actually has a chance of forming a coalition in the event that there are early elections, or are we back in, kind of the cycle of 2019, 2021, etc.?
If you just look at the Israeli map as, let's say, Gantz versus Bibi, then we're going to get back into this numbers of nobody actually is able to get a coalition going. But this is probably not going to be what we're going to see over the next elections. It's much more reasonable that we'll have three big parties. So we have Gantz's party, we have Netanyahu's party, and we'll have a third, what is called a more moderate right-wing party, with many former politicians wanting to lead this party: Lieberman, Bennett, Yossi Cohen, Saar, Shaked, many of these people. If they will be able to come together, it will not be the situation that Gantz against Netanyahu, but we'll have three major parties with about 20 mandates each, which means that two of these parties will be able to form a coalition with no problem. And then the big issue is how the campaign is going to be run. We know what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu wants to say the left is going to establish a Palestinian state. The right wing can only object that if I'm the head of state. So Netanyahu is going to talk about the Palestinian state in order to get the Lieberman, Saar, Shaked group on his side of the anti-Palestinian state campaign. But usually, and if I'm right, and this coalition will crumble over the draft of the Ultra-Orthodox on issues of religion and state, social issues, liberal issues, all these people, Lieberman, Saar, and the rest of them, are with Gantz on the center-left coalition. So there will be probably three big parties, and the two that will actually cooperate after the elections are the ones that are going to have the next coalition. Most likely that it's going to be the moderate right and Gantz's party, and they're going to leave Netanyahu outside of the coalition. But then again, already Lieberman and Saar said that they do not say no personally to Netanyahu, so the game is open.
But does the center left really still stand a chance, considering that all the polls now are showing that Israelis, by and large, are no longer supportive of a two-state solution, especially since the October massacre, and that even the center has moved right?
I disagree. The polls don't show that. But then again, the question is, what is the ideological axis on which you judges? If you look it up on the Jewish versus democratic axis, which is the major political axis of Israeli politics over the last 10 years, then you see that Lieberman and Saar and all the rest of them are part of the liberal camp. So the liberal camp is not just the center and the left, but also the moderate right, the center, and the left. They have a very big majority. If you go back to the old left-right in terms of the Palestinian state, then you can say that the moderate right is objecting to a Palestinian state, but it is not objecting to what Netanyahu himself said in all his interviews in English over the last few weeks, that in Gaza you're supposed to have a local Palestinian authority that is going to be backed by moderate Arab states, and the US with security in the hands of Israel. If you go down this line, and nobody on the right actually objects to that except the very extreme right of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, then there is no much that this is what Gantz wants, this is what Gallant wants, this is what Lieberman wants, and this is what Netanyahu wants. So I disagree with the characterization that the Israelis have moved to the extreme right. It depends how you ask the question. If you ask the question whether Israel should rule Gaza itself, you get very low numbers. If you ask the question whether a Palestinian Authority should lead Gaza, then most of Israelis object, but it depends how you actually ask the question.
Sure. I mean, I most definitely did not say that Israelis are moving to the extreme right. I said that they were moving right because of what happened on October 7th. Where does responsibility for October 7th fit in to the equation of how Israelis might be voting? Because, you know, up until now, it's been very position-based, blaming according to what your ideology is in the first place. Of course, we heard Bezalel Smotrich yesterday saying that the government wasn't responsible, but rather the defense echelon or other bureaucrats who had adopted the conception of Hamas deterrence and so forth. On the other hand, you know, they're not the ones making operative decisions. Where do you think that comes into play? Are constituents able to forgive their leaders? Are they going to remember this in the long run when the elections actually happen?
What we see is that the farther we get away from October 7, the more stable the votes for Netanyahu remain. So this is one way of looking at it, but the real struggle over that is going to be between Netanyahu and Smotrich and others that are going to say it's completely the failure of the military operatives and the Minister of Defense. So the bucket stops with Gallant. So with Gallant, so to speak, and they're going to say Gantz and the Eisenkot are part of what is called the conception. So this is how the right wing is going to look at it. But I think the majority of Israelis cannot see a scenario where Netanyahu is not personally responsible for October 7. So, and you can see that consistently over, if you look at the deeper polls, the ones that monitor the right wing in Israel, you see that by far Netanyahu for the right in Israel is considered the one person which has the most the greatest liability of October 7. And if you remember Netanyahu's own speech after the second Lebanon war, saying to Olmert, you are the head of the state. If the army did something wrong, it is your responsibility to actually fix that or be aware of that, I don't think anyone is going to say Netanyahu is not a part of it. The one thing that Netanyahu counts on is that the investigation committee will take 3 years, 4 years. The guy is 74 years old. He thinks that the results will come after he's already out of politics because of other reasons.
Understood. We're out of time, but I do want to get in two last questions that have been sent in by journalists. The first is in terms of the economic situation. You've addressed many of the other reasons by which Israelis vote, but of course we're looking at hopefully a post-war scenario in which the economy has taken a huge hit, and obviously felt by Israelis in their wallets at the end of the day. Is that something being taken into consideration when going to the polls?
No. The short answer is no. Israelis do not vote on economic background. They vote either on identity politics or on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So we know for many, many years it's not the case. It may be the case that if you look at the vote of the Netanyahu base, the lower middle classes, they may be so angry and so despair that they will not come to vote in great numbers. So we'll see a drop of the people that actually come to vote, especially from the lower middle classes, and this may have a contributing effect on the elections, but Israelis do not vote according to economics.
Very clear. Okay, just one last question that's been sent in. We began with the ultra-Orthodox, so it's fitting that we also finish with them. One journalist is asking if you can explain again the dairies trick, or the...
Yeah, the trick was, instead of bringing a new law that actually exempts the ultra-Orthodox from the draft, because they know that the majority, not only of the center-left, but the majority of the right wing does not support a complete exemption of the draft of the ultra-Orthodox. So the trick was not to vote on the actual exemption from the draft, but to vote for an old law that passed the first call 2 years ago, Gantz's law of 2 years ago. The trick was that Deren and Netanyahu thought that Gantz and Gallant will actually endorse this law because they themselves supported it 2 years ago. And if that was the case, the ultra-Orthodox were not going to vote for it because it would have passed in the votes of both the opposition and coalition. But this crumbled very, very shortly because Gantz and Gallant say we're in a wartime. It's not the usual game of the ultra-Orthodox. The IDF needs at least 13,000 new soldiers very quickly, and it's unacceptable that the ultra-Orthodox would not be drafted. And this is why the vote now counts on the question whether the ultra-Orthodox will actually vote positively for a law that goes back to a law of 2 years ago, which they very firmly oppose. It's a trick because it's just a procedural vote to let the actual law be moved to a committee, which is controlled by Netanyahu, where they can manipulate the actual law and get it into the vote by the end of July. Even if it will not pass by the end of July, the government survived, and that means that the early election would not be called before the Ottoman, which means that the actual elections will only take place in the winter or the spring, which is exactly what Netanyahu wants. So this is why it's just a trick.
Okay, thank you very much for the explanation. Dr. Gayil Talshir, thank you for your time again. And I'm sure that the next conversation we have will be just as interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Have a good weekend and a quiet one as well.